You were fanned out and you begged to come to your house after you heard all these mixtapes. That's how you got in. You was so cool. And we was like, yo, Jomo's a nice guy. Mace like, yo, I think I'll teach him how to rap. Mace actually taught you how to rap.
What if everything you thought you knew about Dipset was a lie? What if Jim Jones, the man who spent the last 20 years calling himself the CEO, the backbone, the street general of Dipset, was never really in charge? What if the real masterminds behind the movement were the very people he now throws shade at? Mace and Cam'ron? And what if the truth isn't coming from rumors or blog speculation, but from Jim's own mouth? Because that's exactly what's happening. In a series of explosive interviews and receipts, Cam and Mace are calling out Jim for rewriting history. And they're backing it up with facts, timelines, and videos that flip his entire origin story upside down. For years, Jim claimed he was the architect of Dipset. But now, voices from Harlem, the very place that gave Dipset its roots, are coming forward to say otherwise. Mace says he taught Jim how to rap. Cam says Jim begged to be let into the crew. And as the footage piles up, it's looking less like beef and more like a full-blown exposure. So how did the so-called CEO become the crew's biggest liability? And how much of Dipset's legacy was built on smoke, mirrors, and borrowed clout? Let's break it down. Harlem isn't just a location. In hip-hop, it's a badge of honor. A cultural epicenter known for birthing legends and setting trends that ripple through the entire genre. So when someone claims Harlem, they're not just repping a place. They're declaring lineage, credibility, and respect. That's why Cam's public takedown of Jim Jones hit so hard. It wasn't just about music, it was about identity. In Cam's words, Jim isn't even from Harlem. According to Cam, Jim was an outsider, someone who inserted himself into the Harlem movement after the wheels were already turning. And that strikes at the very heart of Jim's credibility. For years, Jim branded himself as Dipset's street-certified Harlem general, the capo, the one with the deepest ties to the blocks that birthed legends. But now Cam's saying that narrative is fake. He says Jim was just a fan who pulled up after hearing their freestyles and begged to be let in. That he wasn't a day one soldier, but a latecomer trying to write himself into history. That might sound harsh, but in Harlem and in hip-hop, origin stories matter. You can't claim you were there from the jump if you only showed up once the party was already popping. And when someone like Cam, who's known and respected in Harlem since his early days with Children of the Corn, says you're not from the block, that carries weight. Worse still, Cam isn't the only one questioning Jim's credentials. Mace backs up the claims too, suggesting that Jim was more of a tag-along than a teammate. And when the Harlem elders are publicly distancing themselves from your narrative, it doesn't just sting, it shatters your street image. Jim has spent 2 decades building a persona rooted in Harlem grit. But now, the very city he swore built him is calling him out. And when you get exposed in Harlem, that's not just reputation damage. That's a full-on credibility collapse. In hip-hop, everyone wants to be the architect, the one who laid the blueprint, made the calls, and birthed the movement. And for years, Jim Jones has worn that badge with pride, often referring to himself as the CEO of the Diplomats, the man who held everything together when things got shaky. But according to Cam and Mace, that story isn't just a stretch, it's fiction. Cam is not just throwing casual shade. That's a shot straight at the foundation of Jim's entire career. Because if Cam and Mace are telling the truth, that they created the Dipset movement and Jim merely inserted himself into it, Then Jim's 2 decades of branding himself as the capo and CEO start to unravel. It gets deeper. Mase claims he literally taught Jim how to rap, coached him on cadence, flow, and delivery. That flips the power dynamic on its head. Instead of being a mastermind bringing others under his wing, Jim was the student learning from the very people he now claims to have led. Cam backs that up by pointing out how Jim wasn't on the early mixtapes or in the early freestyles. He says Jim wasn't a street boss putting people on. He was a fan chasing the buzz, hanging around, hoping to get a piece of the spotlight. And when the buzz grew louder, he found his way in. But what happens when that fan starts rewriting the story, claiming he ran the whole show? That's where things get messy. Because in hip-hop, the distinction between being the face and being the foundation is huge. And according to Cam, Jim was never the foundation. He was someone who benefited from the foundation, someone who climbed on board when the ship was already sailing, then later tried to say he built the ship himself. Now, with Mace and Cam pulling back the curtain, that Dipset origin myth is falling apart fast. It's not just about bruised egos or old beef. It's about truth, about who really built what. And if the people who were there from the beginning are calling you out as a latecomer, it's only a matter of time before the fans start asking questions too. Because when you build your whole legacy on a version of the past that isn't real, it only takes one receipt to bring the whole thing crashing down. In fact, the receipts expose something completely different. Dipset wasn't built in the shadows. The fans saw it unfold in real time. The early mixtapes, the street DVDs, the interviews, the backstage freestyles. The real timeline lives on tape. And that's what makes the contradictions so loud. Take, for example, the archival footage of Jim saying clearly and proudly that Mase taught him how to rap.
Well, Mase actually showed me, he was the first person to show me how to rap. That's how I learned how to rap.
That Cam gave him shine on every album out of loyalty, not because Jim was some breakout star. His own words, on camera. And yet, years later, he's telling a completely different story. That he helped them come up, that he was the one keeping things afloat. You can't be both the apprentice and the architect. Cam and Mase aren't just challenging his claims, they're dismantling them with exact quotes, timestamps, and first-hand accounts. When Cam says Jim was a fan who asked to be around after hearing the freestyles, it cuts deeper than any diss track. Because it's not about clout or bars, it's about identity. Jim's entire image is built on the idea that he's a self-made boss, a street general who turned music into money and led a movement. But now, we're being shown a different version of events, one where he didn't lead anything. He followed, studied, and positioned himself behind the real innovators until the public believed he belonged. And when confronted with the contradictions, Jim doesn't push back with facts. He doubles down on the performance. He gets louder, more aggressive, throws out deflections like they're just hating, or worse, resorts to body-shaming Mase as a distraction. But that only fuels the fire. Because when people stop arguing the facts and start attacking the person, that's usually the moment they've run out of truth. In hip-hop, your word is your bond. Your origin story is your badge. And once the receipts expose you for rewriting your past, the respect starts to crumble fast. Jim's media run, his interviews, his tough talk, it's starting to look less like confidence and more like damage control. And the more he talks, the more the timeline fractures. In the digital age, the internet remembers everything. Fans have been going back, pulling up old clips, comparing dates, matching statements. What they're finding isn't just inconsistent. It's incriminating. Because if you built your empire on someone else's foundation, all it takes is one crack in the story for the whole thing to fall. Because in Harlem, and in hip-hop, being a fan isn't the insult. Lying about it is. Cam told stories that cut deep, like how Jim was once chased through a hotel to the beach, wet, barefoot, scared. Not the capo image he's been pushing. And how he showed up to French Montana's movie premiere only to find out he was being dissed on screen and had to sit through it. That's not just disrespect, that's humiliation. And it shows just how far Jim has fallen from the Harlem pedestal he once claimed. But it goes even deeper than anecdotes. Cam broke down Jim's behavior over time, how he jumps into beef with people, only to buddy up when the smoke clears. He tried to chase French Montana out the game, and now he's at his movie premiere. He had issues with countless artists, but somehow always ends up trying to spin the story to make himself look like the connector, the loyal one, the backbone. But real Harlem? They don't talk loyalty. They move with it. Cam said it plainly. Real ones don't have to keep saying they're from Harlem. Harlem knows who's from Harlem and Mace. He's not even fazed. Despite the body shaming and disrespect Jim threw his way, Mace stayed focused, brushing off the insults with a calm that only confidence in truth can bring. This entire section of the saga shows one thing. When you distort history long enough, eventually the original authors come back to claim their pen. And the difference between Cam and Jim? Cam doesn't need to scream. He just tells the story exactly how it happened. Because when you're telling the truth, you don't need to memorize the script. Jim, on the other hand, is running out of rehearsed lines. And the more he talks, the more it shows.